Why, hello there, how are you today? Awesome Soul here, and today we will be going over the topic of balance, which is something that is hotly debated in the community pretty much every day. There's certainly no end to the stream of comments and threads on the forums, Reddit, etc., talking about pretty much everything in the game. If it's in there, I'm sure it's been brought up at some point or another. But what I never really see happening is people talking about why Robocraft is so difficult to balance. And that's kind of what I want to weigh in on here. The first thing that comes to mind is that with most games, all you really have to do is balance the gameplay. You know, the movement and gunplay, etc. Of course, I'll be talking about shooters in this example. So in that section, they would balance things like weapons and maps, and then a few other minor things. And then that's more or less it. But when it comes to Robocraft, you've got different movement parts. So every player is going to be moving at a different speed, and not only that, they also move and react to things completely differently. But the biggest thing here is that Robocraft requires gameplay skill and building skill. So two major factors that have to go through major balancing. Of course though, there are some more complex shooters out there, I guess we can say, such as Overwatch, where a lot of the characters move at different speeds, and some of them can even fly, double jump, wall crawl, etc. But more or less, they're kind of restricted to the same style of movement. So those familiar with Overwatch, say you've got Roadhog's shotgun, and then you hand that over to Genji. So now all of a sudden, you've got a very fast and nimble character with this big, huge, beefy shotgun. How exactly do you go about balancing that? Well, in some ways, that's kind of what Robocraft has to deal with, since you can attach an ion distorter onto a tank track bot, a hover bot, a flying bot, a helicopter, a mech, etc. The heavy amount of mixing and matching makes things even more complex. And when it comes to actually building things, there are a huge amount of crazy techniques that you can use to make your bot a whole lot tougher. And it would seem that a fair amount of people don't really know these. One that comes to mind is severing weak points. So, if you want to add a huge amount of cubes onto your bot, and you're sort of new and you see, wow, I've got a huge health stat total, I must be really tanky. But your bot has all of these weird spindly arms on it. That's really not going to help you at all. It's just going to make your bot die a lot quicker, because as soon as they cut that connection, everything that's on the lower end of the CPU side, so basically whichever side is severed has the lowest CPU, that's going to be cut off, basically giving the opponent bonus damage to you if they can sever these connections. And as you can expect, players with low building skill will be the first to cry that something's overpowered. I mean, he just cut my bot in half. This whole section is now completely gone. What's happening? Well, it's simply because they probably didn't armor it correctly, or set up the connections right, etc, etc. And also, on a similar note, there are a huge amount of bot types out there. The amount of creativity in this game is rather massive. And not only that, the amount of playstyles in this game are also pretty high as well. Say for example, you have a player who really likes playing air units. That is solely what they play. They will very rarely, if ever, go onto the ground. What do you think that player is going to be killed by most? Well, I'm going to hazard a guess and say it's flak, rail, and the lock-on missile launcher. Although, honestly, lock-on missile launcher is kind of a joke. I think it needs a slight rework at this point, but that's a topic for another time. And, as I said, this hypothetical player does not play on the ground much, if at all. So their experience in the game is somewhat limited based on that. Therefore, they're going to complain a lot about flak being overpowered, rails being overpowered, and missiles being overpowered. Because those three weapons are very good at countering that bot type. However, if we have another player playing a more tanky style, say they like to build mechs and tanks with a huge amount of armor on them, well, this player would not have the same problems as the other player who only ever plays flyers. Flak is absolutely no problem, lock-on missile launcher is a bit of a joke, it's really only going to tickle you, and rails might be a slight problem, but if you build yourself in more of a gun bed style, then with all your redundant weapons, doesn't really matter too much. What this player probably will complain about being overpowered though, would be Teslas and ion distorters. because this player tends to build less offensive bots that have lots of armor and are obviously rather slow as well, they cannot outrun the Tesla bots and they cannot outrun the Ions. So once those get close, they have very limited options. And as such, all of the players who build with that tanky playstyle will be complaining about Teslas and Ions being more overpowered. Or at least they have a higher tendency to. But our flying friend wouldn't really complain about those, as the few Tesla flyers that are still out there tend to focus on taking out ground units, and ion destroyers are fairly heavy and bulky, so very rarely, if at all, will you ever see them in the air. And as well, they are used in a similar fashion more often than not as Teslas, as an anti-ground weapon, if you are a flyer of course. And with them being close-range weapons, all of the ground bots will never, ever have a chance to use their Teslas or Ions against a flyer. So they're not really a problem for our flyer friend. They seem balanced, because they never really have to interact with them that much. So the moral of the story here is try and play as many bot types as you possibly can. Experience taking damage and giving out damage from as many different playstyles as humanly possible. Don't just simply stick to one type. The next thing I kind of want to touch on is a little bit minor, but this also goes for really any game that's out there, and that is player temperament. When a game developer is taking in feedback, they don't really know a whole lot about this person at all, really. Are they the super hot-headed type? If they die too quickly, well, then they're just going to simply quit out the match. Or are they the meek and mild type, who don't really complain about anything? Of course, those two are definitely at the end of the extremes. Most people are kind of in the middle. So yes, going back to the game developer's perspective, again, they don't know a huge amount about this person. So when they've written up their response to saying X item is overpowered, has that person sat down, weighed all the pros and cons about it, checked the stats, or have they simply had a few bad run-ins with one particular weapon, and now feel the need to rant about it? And this last point is a particularly Robocraft only thing, although there could be some other games out there like this that have had a similar problem. And that is, from the information I've gathered over the years, it seems like the way Robocraft started out is as basically a cool, fun little different tech demo, I guess we can say. In the beginning, it was fairly simple. All you really had were some cubes and some wheels, and there you go. It's basically Lego in a video game form. Although there have been some actual Lego games out there. Then more features were added to it, and the community actually grew fairly fast, to the point where they actually had server issues. So they had a very basic concept of just build cool little Lego creations, and then they decided to take the game further. But it wasn't like some other games. This was kind of like a very basic bare bones idea, and then they formed a game around it. Whereas other games, like for example, Titanfall, there you go, there's a good example, had a huge amount of planning that went into it before it was even publicly available. This way, players knew exactly what they were getting themselves into. With Robocraft, however, it's gone in one direction and then turned a little bit slightly to the left, and people are like, oh, maybe we should go a little bit back to the center. I kind of liked it when it was on that path. And then the direction of the game keeps turning farther to the left, and then those same people that still wanted Robocraft to go down the center road are now even more annoyed. They feel like, hey, this isn't the game I signed up for. It should have clearly gone in this direction. Whereas the other players who decided to go along the left road with FreeJam are now quite happy. Then from that point, FreeJam decides to turn to the right a little bit, but the players on the left path still keep going. And they're like, hey, why aren't you continuing down this left path? I thought development was going that way. And then you have the people on the center path who are still a little angry because it's not quite along that development path. And then you have another crowd of people who are like, hey, come on back to the left path. Why aren't you going this way? Hopefully that little example there gave you a proper visualization in your head. I thought it was a fairly simple example. But yeah, so when FreeJam decides to change directions with their game, the more amount of people they kind of alienate, I guess we can say. So then, because the game's been in development for over 3 years, you now have these pockets of people that think the game should have gone in this direction, and then another pocket of people that think it should have done this, and then another group that thinks it should have gone this way, and another group that thinks it should have gone that way, and the list goes on and on. So, not exactly commenting on which direction the game should have gone in. That's more of your own personal taste. But the point I'm trying to make is, with all of these different enclaves of people wanting different things out of the game, it makes sifting through the feedback from the players that much more difficult, because as a developer, you don't know which enclave this person comes from, and you'll go to another thread on the forums and you'll see something completely different, because that person comes from a different enclave which thinks Robocraft should have gone in a completely different direction from the other person. So really, the only thing you've ever had set in stone with Robocraft is that it's building with Lego and taking it into a battle arena game. That's really the base of it. And along the way, there are a lot of changes. But, as I actually touched on in the last video, and a few times before that actually, it has been stated that this recent update, the Damage Boost update, is the final mechanic overhaul to Robocraft. So that means we're not going to be getting any more crazy meta-defining and breaking changes. All we're going to be getting are new weapons, new parts, and new movement. At least that's what I kind of interpret from what they've said. So there we have it. Those are more or less all of my thoughts on why it's so difficult to actually balance Robocraft, and why it never really seems to be balanced in the eyes of the players. Though that's another thing I do need to touch on. There is the idea that is the players are one big amorphous mass, but that's not really true. Anyways guys, hopefully you've enjoyed my little ramble here. I'm curious to know what your thoughts on all of this are down below. So with that, I of course have been the Awesome Soul. I thank you so very much for watching, and I will see you next time. Take care.